forward to spending the next few days with you, and we're so grateful that many of you have traveled really long distances just to be here with us. Over 120 scholars, I think it's maybe 135, something like that, scholars and activists from across the country are presenting more than 50 papers, speaking on panels, discussing issues from militarism, intimacy, joy, politics, and the future, sometimes all of those things at once. Or they're hosting workshops and strategy sessions that will challenge how we engage with the world and our departments as feminists and geographers. All of us organizers are really excited to meet you. As you can tell, we're wearing these snazzy t-shirts. Please come introduce yourselves to us. We'd love to meet all of you. This conference aims to continue the conversation that started at the first geography conference. Some of you were there in Nebraska a couple years ago in 2014. And some folks from that conference, like Pamela Moss and Karen Falconer Al-Hindi, were there and are now here. So we're so glad that you all could come. After several of us went there and were really inspired by what happened in Omaha, we wanted to bring the conference here. And it was really Betsy and also Mike Dimple over there who had this idea to try to bring the conference here. So we're really glad that it's finally happening. And I'm going to turn this over to Sir Tanya.
So we find this to be a particularly important moment to query, build, extend, and question the borders of feminist geography. And so in that spirit, we've organized our conference around the themes of the insides and outsides of feminism. And so taking up that theme, we hope to collectively inquire, how does feminist theory travel in geography? What borders does feminism cross, break down, or reinforce? How do we even define feminism in geography? Can we push the boundaries of feminism without it losing its core commitments? Who claims feminism and to what ends? And how do theory, politics, and activism shape the spaces of feminism? So now I'm going to pass it on to Betsy to give you a little more information about the amazing people who helped make this happen.
Hello, welcome. As you can imagine, the amazing people behind me were a large part of why this happened. So I think if we even just give them a big round of applause. But they're not actually on my list. So let me read my list, which Dan Warfield, Nell Phillips, and Barbara Taylor of the Geography Department have been indispensable. Francisco Lasso, who is still helping, there in the corner. Merane Curas, and some of these you'll notice mentioned in your program as having contributed to art or other supports for our conference. Zach Ward and Diana Devereaux, who were fundamental in helping us secure this location and actually run the conference here. And most importantly, the Feminist Geography Conference organizers from the 2014 Omaha meeting, which was amazing for those of you who went and really inspired us to want to continue these conversations and have a different kind of space where we can have these great people, and we'll have even more tomorrow and the day after. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about building practicalities. So stairs and elevators. In the far corner, if you're a geographer like I am, then that means when you enter the front, you will go to your left. In that far corner are the elevators. Those go to all the floors, including the 4th floor, which can only be accessed by the stairs that are also on that side of the building over there. The rest of the building can be accessed by these large stairs that you see as you enter in and cannot miss. Our rooms, conference rooms, are on the ground floor right here, the 2nd floor, 3rd floor. All of this is pretty self-explanatory if you've been on different floors of the building before. It's as you would expect. In each of the rooms, there are papers that have instructions for the people who are timekeeping and so on, so do pay attention to that. There will also be a paper that has a telephone number for tech support. I am tech support, and if you happen to be a techie kind of person, let me know before the end of the evening because I'd love your assistance. We have the general space in the building, the outdoor space. We encourage you to make yourself at home. It's a wonderful facility, and even if the weather turns, we can all be inside, which is great. Do be aware that if you are presenting or attending sessions in the 2008-2010 rooms, that there are offices right beside that. So tomorrow there might be people working, and just bear that in mind when you're using those. Parking, it's Chapel Hill. There is no parking. But on Saturday, everything opens up. So you can park in the parking lot that is underneath the building. You can park in any of these lots that are assigned to the university. And they're not supposed to do anything with your vehicle if you do that on Saturday. And I shall now turn this over to Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Betsy. So as everyone said, we're really excited to have everyone here, but we did want to take a moment to acknowledge many people who can't join us today because of political circumstances, both in North Carolina and globally. So despite the recent half-hearted attempt by our governor and legislature to repeal HB2, the so-called bathroom bill continues to unfairly discriminate against the trans community here, putting those who live here and those who would travel here at serious risk. And we've heard from many potential conference attendees who are unable to travel to North Carolina because of this bill. The recent travel ban that targeted several Muslim-majority nations made traveling to this conference from outside the United States impossible for many people. Two of the organizers of our session on Muslim geographies, Azita Ranjbar and Negar Bezadi, were forced to withdraw their abstracts when their visa was denied. Lauren Hull and Shannon Grohl, two activists and students from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, withdrew their paper on academic solidarity after the Department of Justice last week refused to charge officers in the shooting death of Alton Sterling. They write, "Our community is in upheaval, but we continue to be actively engaged in events that unfold and in supporting the Baton Rouge community." Finally, we recognize that the costs of registering and traveling to this conference make it impossible for precarious faculty, students, and workers to join us today. And we have worked to include some people through remote connections, but as we begin having conversations over the next 3 days that will advance the project of feminist geography, we do ask that you recognize that these voices, among many others, are not with us today. And I will turn it over to Banu.
Thank you. I'm Banu Gökariksel, and I'd like to talk a little bit about why UNC-Chapel Hill is hosting this geography, this feminist geography conference. And I want to start by thanking Elsa Cravey, who's here, who's over there, for actually starting feminist geography in our department in geography with her book on groundbreaking work on women's labor in maquiladoras. And we all know how hard it was to do that, and really appreciate and continue to appreciate everything that Alta has done for all of us in the department and also at the university and also in North Carolina more generally. So thank you. I didn't warn Alpha that I was going to do this. I just asked her on the phone yesterday if she's going to be here. So thank you. So since then, we've been really great to have a series of people who've been hired and who have been actually our undergraduate students, graduate students who've been really interested in feminist geography and who has helped us push forward feminist geography in our department through the courses that we teach, through the research projects that we do, and also through other kinds of different kinds of projects that we have been engaging with, and we really appreciate the contributions of all of them. And you can see today, a lot of those people, definitely in the organizing committee, but also in the audience, and some people who are going to be joining us tomorrow as well. And I hope when you leave the conference, you'll leave with a sense that feminist geography is thriving here at UNC-Chapel Hill and is a very important part of our teaching and research at all levels, undergraduate and graduate, and informs our research projects, questions we ask, conversations we have, and the things that we do, sometimes in the department, sometimes outside of the department as well in other spaces. And more broadly, at UNC-Chapel Hill, feminist theory, research, and activism have many homes and fosters many connections far and wide. The Department of Women's and Gender Studies at UNC, and I know people from there, yeah, like Karen is there, and also at Duke, Francis is there, right? So, and at Duke, and these were among the first actually women's studies departments in the US. So it's important also, it's very important for us to have those connections with these departments. And the graduate students of the Department of Communication have started to organize an annual conference called Feminism Here and Now. This last fall, we had the second of that conference, and that conference has been great actually to bring different people who are interested in feminist theory together. And our hope starting today is also to continue those conversations and enable new ones to emerge as well. And because of this, the vibrancy of strength of feminist geography here on campus, a large group of undergraduate and graduate students and faculty have been working on organizing this conference. The organizing committee includes Amy Brown, whom I haven't seen, but she was very instrumental, especially at the beginning before she had to take off for research. Cheryl Faulkner, who's over there, Banu Gökariksel, Pallavi Gupta, who's now in India and who's going to start the PhD program, and she actually helped us even before she was, part of the PhD program. Mike Hawkins, Nina Martin, who's being shy and guarding the back of the room. Chris Newbert, there she is. Adeyemi Olatunde, who's an undergraduate student in geography and who's been like a miracle organizer. He really whipped us into shape and kind of made sure that we have spaces to hold this conference. Betsy, who's there? Yeah, Betsy Olson, Michelle Hadley, and did I say Sartanya already? Sartanya, ready, and Sarah Smith, and Gabriele Valdivia, who's flying in with a group of amazing, actually, artists from Ecuador today. And Willie Wright. Yeah. So I want to applaud all the members of this committee for their commitment, hard work, and good humor. Organizing this conference also enabled us to connect with one another in different ways as well. So it's been amazing. And we are all wearing Black Conference t-shirts, so that feature FemGeog logo and the Hurston Hall drawing on the back. And find us to ask your questions. I know a couple of people have already gotten in their tote bags and started wearing them, but you can also try them as well. I see one person over there. And Mike Hawkins is going to talk a little bit more about these logos and their meaning and talk a little bit more about the other work that we have been doing here as well. Or is it Willie?
No, I need to grab Cool. So in addition to organizing a conference, which I don't recommend doing both of these things in the same year, a big group of us organized a feminist collective, mostly of graduate students and faculty in our department. And we came up with Pavicha came up with the acronym FLOC, stands for Feminists Liberating Our Collective Knowledge. So in addition to attempting to sort of do some of those things, both within the university and within our department, that acronym inspired a number of bird jokes, feathery sort of email signatures, and sort of let us come together as a collective known as FLOC. So as you look in your swag, you'll notice a zine that FLOC produced, as well as on the table outside a number of postcards that we distributed at last year's AAG and the most recent AAG. So with these postcards and the zine, we look to draw attention to some of the racial struggles, both within our own campus and make connections more broadly with everyone else at different universities within the US in different contexts. So the zine in particular that you all will find in your conference bag was a product of FLOC's year-long struggle to go to the archives and make sense of the racialized landscape here at UNC. Our t-shirt and the program both include the original feminist geography logo inspired by those wonderful folks at Omaha from 2014. And on the back of your t-shirt is an image of Hurston Hall. designed by Francisco Lasso and Meharni Kuras. So we include these images in the conference materials to honor student activists who struggled for more than 30 years to rename the building that houses the Department of Geography, once named for a KKK leader. Student activists over about a 30-year period, and particularly in most recent iterations in post-2015, organized around the name Zora Neale Hurston, looking to change the name our department is housed in to Hurston Hall, highlighting Zora Neale Hurston, who used to teach in Durham, just up the road. And while she was teaching, she took a class at UNC, but when the administration found out that she was taking a class, the class was officially told to move off campus. And in Paul Green, a professor at the time, they relocated to his house so that Zora Neale Hurston could take part. So we've included both that logo in the conference program and on the t-shirts to signal our respect for the students who push us to change and a reminder of the inclusions and exclusions at the very heart of this university and the conference. So I'm going to turn it back to Banu.
Sorry, yeah, back to me. Okay, great. Now we're transitioning to the opening panel. And I'm just going to introduce the panel generally and tell you what we actually asked the panelists to think about, to speak about. And then we have actually different people introducing each of the panelists. And maybe you can sit down. You don't have to stand up. Yeah. Okay, so at this conference, we hope to create an engaging space for conversation about the work that feminism does or doesn't do for us, and in which directions we would like feminist theory, scholarship, and teaching to develop. So the broader questions that we have are, what is the potential for feminism to inform our analyses of lived experience, political life, and power? And how can we activate these analyses to transform our institutions, our everyday life, and our world? We have asked the panelists to reflect on the following questions and then engage with one another and the questions from the audience. So number one, what are you most excited about in your work today? 2, what borders does feminism cross, break down, or reinforce? 3, how does feminism inform your strategies and practices for working within and or outside of academic institutions? And lastly, how do theory, politics, and activism shape the spaces of feminism? And how might we build on its strengths and push it further? So Michelle is going to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Hi, I'm introducing Dr. Kia Lily Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell is an associate professor of African, African American, and Diaspora Studies and an adjunct associate professor of anthropology at UNC-Chapel Hill. She is the co-director of the African Diaspora Fellows Program, which provides professional development to middle and high school teachers in North Carolina. She's also the director of faculty diversity initiatives in the College of Arts and Sciences at UNC. Her research and teaching focus on race, gender, health policy, HIV/AIDS, and human rights in Brazil and the US. Her new book, Health Equity in Brazil, Intersections of Gender, Race, and Policy, will be published by the University of Illinois Press in June of 2017. Please welcome Dr. Kia Lily Caldwell.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction. And I'd like to thank Sarah, Banu, Betsy, and all of the other folks who extended the invitation to me and have organized this really impressive conference, especially on the heels of the semester. This is pretty ambitious because we're all a bit tired, I think, at this point. So I'm going to kind of go through the questions that were sent to me and also try to stick to my time. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I also have been doing work in medical anthropology for the past 10 years or so. And so I'm not a geographer, but I do think there's quite a bit of overlap between what geographers, cultural geographers do, especially, and cultural anthropologists. I've been doing research on and in Brazil for over 20 years, and I've also written about Black women's activism and issues of race and gender there. So working in Brazil and also having familiarity with Black women's experiences in Latin America and the Caribbean and other areas of the African diaspora have really provided me, I think, with a valuable perspective on issues and dynamics that affect Black women across national borders. And I was looking at an essay by Augustine Lau Montes and Marangela Buggs about translocal Black feminisms, especially in Latin America, but in the African diaspora, in the Translocalities book that Sonia Alvarez and Claudia de Lima Costa and several other people co-edited, and it really kind of, I think, resonated with some of the questions and issues that I've been interested in for a while. So our first question was, what are you most excited about in your work today? And as I think about current and future projects, especially now that I have a book coming out, and I sort of feel like, oh, do I really have to write anything else ever again? But of course, you know, we keep going. But I'm really interested in bringing a more explicitly comparative and transnational perspective to the work that I do, because a lot of my writing has been based on looking at Brazil. And this has been a long-term goal of mine for quite a while, but I also think that when we study communities and sites that have really been overlooked, that have been understudied, it's very helpful to get a grounding in those places, their histories, the politics, the activism that's taking place in those places before we start to really think comparatively. And I guess that's also the anthropologist in me. I don't like to do quick and dirty research, right? Working more in fields like public health has, for instance, been a challenge for me because they do research very quickly. And I don't think the deep sort of historical and cultural knowledge of communities is something that is valued as much. So I'm really interested in sort of looking at the transnational and what we could also call translocal experiences of Black women across these different borders. But I also think it's important to have the empirical evidence to help us ground what we're talking about, so that it's not just mentioning some place in one sentence, right? But really having a deeper knowledge of those places. But also I just wanted to highlight the fact that there are other people who are doing this work, and there's a whole new cadre of really Black feminists, anthropologists, and sociologists, many of whom are based in the US, but also a growing number in Latin America, who are doing really great work on Afro-Latin feminisms. So it's encouraging to see that happening in several fields. In terms of borders that feminism crosses, breaks down, or reinforces, I really think it's extremely helpful to think about how we are defining feminism, and also to keep in mind that all forms of feminism are not the same. And I'm probably preaching to the choir, right, in saying this. But, you know, for example, all forms of feminism are not anti-racist. Intersectional feminism that acknowledges and challenges how racism, sexism, capitalism, and other forms of inequality are related can contribute to crossing and potentially breaking down barriers of difference and inequality in important ways. But we should, I think, keep in mind that this is not automatic. So I've personally increasingly come to define feminism as both a belief and a practice. And this actually came out of talking to my 14-year-old son around the time that Chimamanda Adichie was on campus last month, and asking him what he thought of feminism, trying to kind of sneak the conversation in there. And so I think it's important for us to not just believe in feminism, but to act on those beliefs in our everyday lives, because it's very easy to say, I'm a feminist, but then what do we do? And I don't think it's only the big things, it's the small things too. So I've started to think more about the active or activist or praxis side of feminism more, since people who consider themselves to be anti-racist, I think, are typically taking action and not just self-identifying as anti-racist. Because those people often are part of a movement. Maybe it's Black Lives Matter, you know. So I think that there's a way in which we can identify something but not act on those beliefs, and that's something that I'm trying to challenge. So I think this also needs to be done by those of us who self-identify as feminists. It's not just a matter of belief, but also of action. And And the essay that I mentioned earlier by Augustine Lalmontes and Mirangela Buggs, they ended by pointing to a march and sort of a statement that some Afro-Colombian women made, where they said that you can't be a feminist and be racist, which I think is an important challenge. You know, and these kinds of issues came up also with the Women's March in January, you know, here, in terms of, you know, people saying it's great that there are so many people at this march, but who will be at the next Black Lives Matter march, right? So we tend to separate these things out very often. In terms of how feminism informs my strategies and practices for working within and or outside of academic institutions, I spend a lot of my time here on this campus, as do many of the folks who are here today. Many of us are trying to change the way universities operate, whether we're here or someplace else. So this is primarily where a lot of my feminist practice plays out, although I definitely try to bring feminist values and ethics to my other roles and identities, whether that's as a mother, as a community member, you know, as a friend, you know, sort of practicing feminist ethics. With respect to academic institutions, my feminist sensibilities help me to be keenly aware of issues of gender inequity, the underrepresentation or under-acknowledgement of women in the academy, and also particular issues and challenges that affect women of color. As many of us realize, academic institutions can be extremely slow to change, so promoting feminist transformation in these sites can be challenging. And I think this is especially true as a lot of our universities, colleges and universities become more conservative, become more corporatized, are affected by external politics, as we've seen here in North Carolina, but also across the country with respect to public higher education, and also the limits that are placed on public higher education with respect to undocumented students or so many other things that sometimes private universities can take action on, but public universities might be more constrained about, or the leadership feels that they are. I know that tomorrow there will be a feminist mentoring session at lunchtime, which I think is great. We're having a lot of conversations on campus about mentoring. So I'm curious to hear, you know, what some of the people here at the conference are thinking in terms of these issues too, because you don't often hear feminists and mentoring paired together, right? So I think that that's really important in terms of change. So in terms of thinking about theory, politics, and activism, one of the things I've emphasized in my work for many years is that activists are theorists. I study Black women's activism in Brazil, and you know, the people that we look at in terms of our research are thinkers too, right? But so often what we write and what we say is privileged over the communities that we study. And you know, there are all these different asymmetries that can exist, especially if you're coming from the US and doing research in the global South, right? So for me, there's not such a large divide between theory, politics, and activism. I think that all of these things are interrelated. Activists generate theory. They're trying to make change that is extremely important in many cases, and we need to listen to what they're saying. So viewing activists as theorists or as organic intellectuals in the Gramscian sense, I think can also decenter the work we do as academics in important ways. As a cultural anthropologist, my graduate training emphasized taking theory into the field. And it emphasized this instead of seeing the field in many ways and my interlocutors as producers of theory. This was the mid-1990s. We were talking about Bourdieu and Foucault. And I hear you're still talking about, right? Bourdieu and Foucault. I mean, there's still the pressure, you know, to engage with these white males, dead white males in many cases, and to frame our projects in terms of how they have sort of conceptualized social dynamics and so forth. And I was resistant to that. So I think, you know, what kind of theory we take into the field, who we take into the field, which books we take, which sort of conceptualizations are really important. And I also think this push to take certain types of theory, especially Western theory, Eurocentric theory, and sort of impose it on what we find, is especially problematic given the forms of othering that often take place between anthropologists and other researchers who do field work and the communities we study. It can also encourage, of course, we know, the appropriation of intellectual insights from these communities and the service of building one's career. So, these are things that have been pointed out over and over again. Since feminist methodologies often are more collaborative and often pay attention to power dynamics, they can provide alternative ways of doing research and living our lives as academics that may counter some of the problems that I'm mentioning here. However, we should also keep in mind that these alternative epistemologies and methodologies are often being utilized within institutional structures that have very different values and priorities. So of course, in the field like anthropology, we still look for the single authored work, right? Including the communities that you study as co-authors, that's often frowned upon. Or, so how do we begin to break down some of these institutional structures that still constrain us? And using feminism to really rethink those institutional structures, I think is very important. So I'll stop there and pass the baton, I guess, to the next introducer. Thank you.
So thank you, Kia. I've got the pleasure to introduce Lorraine Dowler next. Lorraine is an associate professor of geography and women, gender, and sexuality studies at Penn State University. Lorraine is the author of several publications focusing on issues of gender and war in Northern Ireland. Her current research project is a feminist examination of the feminist geopolitics of the Cold War, the War on Terror, and the new military. So with that, Lorraine Dowler.
I too would very much like to thank you for the invitation here. I'm so honored to be here. When I think about feminist geography, I think about this place. When I think about feminist activism and geography, Alpha, this is going to be your weekend because I think about you. So I'm just so pleased to be here to talk about feminist activism, about feminist theory. Like Kia, I cannot pull these things apart. I have friends in engineering who won't go to the movies with me anymore because they're just like, you're going to come out and analyze, so what I thought I would do today, and thank you, Mike, for the introduction. The work that I'm doing now is being highly influenced on the really fantastic work that's being done in geography on care ethics. What I'm trying to do is intersect care ethics with feminist geopolitics and to understand especially today in the society that we're dealing with, the government we're dealing with, what a careful geopolitics might look like. I'm thinking about this. I have a couple of projects that I'm working on, but I thought for today, I would take a step closer to home and talk about the most recent scandal in Penn State that just happened in the last couple of months, which is the death of Timothy Piazza, who is a 19-year-old student who died in a fraternity hazing that you've probably seen Timothy's parents on the news quite extensively because the grand jury report just came out with quite a few indictments of our students. So what I thought I would do is take these questions and try to read this case through the questions so you can see. I don't think I'm going to tell you anything new because I think the way we approach things as feminist scholars is probably going to be very similar. This is just a case that my office overlooks this fraternity. So every day I come in and I see this building. So I've been thinking a lot about it. I've been thinking about, I'm going to be writing something with some colleagues, hopefully for the conversation, that blog, in order about this. And that's what I try to do as part of my activism too, is continually write and try to put pressure on the administration about things that are going on at Penn State. So I'm going to stick, since this report just came out a couple of days ago, I'm just going to kind of stick pretty close to my notes on this. So as I said, I've been thinking about the death of a 19-year-old Penn State student. He died on February 4th due to head injuries that resulted from a hazing incident in the Penn State chapter of Beta Theta Pi fraternity. The hazing started on February 2nd and he died on February 4th. As I just mentioned, the grand jury just released its report, which recommends charges against 18 students at Penn State. in the local chapter, but charges are also being launched against the national organization. And there may be charges against Penn State also. The grand jury's asked for further information to see if Penn State is promoting a culture of violence. The charges range from involuntary manslaughter, aggravated assault, simple assault, I'm not quite sure what that is, recklessly endangering another person, hazing. Hazing in the state of Pennsylvania is one of the few states that consider that a misdemeanor. It's a felony in most states now. Furnishing alcohol to minors and unlawful acts relative to liquor. Also tampering with evidence. I think, yeah, 8 of the Penn State students of the 18 are being charged with all of what I've just mentioned. So I'd like to take the remaining time to work through questions. So for example, what borders does feminist cross, break down, or reinforce? I think that feminist scholars and justice scholars are probably seeing this case differently, certainly differently than I think our administration is. As heart-wrenching as this case is, as a feminist scholar, I'm just not surprised by it. For a long time, we've been expecting a death due to the fraternity culture at Penn State, and unfortunately, we've now seen it. We're well aware of violence associated with fraternities and that a competitive testosterone-driven environment fueled by large-scale parties at fraternity houses are ideal surroundings for predatory behavior. Recent statistics, I'm drawing on 2 studies here, suggest that fraternity members are 62% more likely than non-fraternity members to commit a sexual assault, and women in sororities are 74% more likely to experience sexual assault than other college women. These statistics seem extraordinary, but so do other statistics regarding sexual assault, such as the staggering numbers of both men and women who are raped in the military. Even though we understand that these types of hyper-masculinized environments can facilitate violence, that often where blame is often placed on the victim, as for example, what do you expect when women enter the military, as our president tweeted. As Jenna Kristen, who's in the audience here, and Dana Croma and I have written elsewhere, in order to understand institutional violence, we need to appreciate the fluid ways that both the hot, in terms of hot immediate violence, and the banal intermingle. And feminist work that examines this fluid nature binaries, especially that we've seen in geography, such as public-private, war-peace, intimate-global, demonstrate the difficulty of separating out these 2 categories, that they are interdependent on each other. This is certainly the case when examining what some might call an unfortunate instance or simple lapse of judgment on the part of the fraternity brothers. However, as feminist scholars, we can see that the shocking nature of this violence is deeply seated in its own banality. So when I'm thinking about how does feminism inform my strategies and practices with working within or with outside an academic institution, as a feminist scholar and activist, what I try to do is destabilize forms of violence that have become normalized, that they are often rendered invisible. I do this with my research, but I also try to play this way, thinking about the institutions where I live and I work, such as Penn State. So in 2012, Nicola Laberte, who's in the audience here, and Dana Coleman and I wrote a viewpoint piece for Gender, Place, and Culture titled Challenging the Penn State Way, a feminist response to institutional violence in higher education. At that time, we argued a feminist intervention into the Sandusky scandal at Penn State University was needed as a radical alternative to rethinking institutional violence as the places of higher learning. We argued that a feminist ethics of care and responsibility is necessary to negate the day-to-day feelings of fear and vulnerability that institutional violence supports. So similar to the Sandusky scandal, there's now new sets of policies and practices being put to place to govern Greek life at Penn State, but I'm relatively certain that this will do little to change fraternity culture. As social justice researchers, we're all too familiar with how law or policies may change, but that does not result in the immediate transformation of culture. It is, of course, critical to societies and institutions to change laws and policies that allow, or at times even promote violence, but we just need to take a look at dismantling of historic Jim Crow laws to see that it hasn't dismantled white supremacy in this country. So for me, the question is, how can my training as a feminist scholar help change a culture of masculinity at Penn State? So at this point, I'm going to offer you a very rough analysis of the grand jury report. And what I'm going to do is focus on 3 concepts I think really demonstrate the banality of violence that is happening at Penn State that has helped trigger this hot moment of the death of this young man. So the first is the gauntlet, which was the process of pouring incredible amounts of alcohol into the pledges at different stations in the frat house. A concept of backpacking, which is a common procedure that I've just learned in frat houses, where you put a backpack of books on someone who's unconscious from alcohol so that they cannot roll over onto their backs and aspirate. And finally, what can only be viewed as banal forms of intimidation that are very commonplace activities for pledges to endure at Penn State. And I think these are pretty common practices in many fraternities. So on February 2nd, Piazza and other initiatives to the Beta Theta Pi fraternity had to run the gauntlet, a series of stations where they had to chug wine, vodka, and beer. They also had to eat what was in the report called a mush of rotten food that was left over from the fraternity's kitchen. So approximately between 90 minutes of Timothy walking through the house store, he had fallen down the stairs to the basement. His blood alcohol, the coroner has determined at that point his blood alcohol level was 0.40. So he was certainly at poisoning levels at only 90 minutes in. The fraternity members later found him at the bottom of the stairs. One wrote in a group text or a message, and I quote here that, and this is what the grand jury, I have to say the report as a researcher is really pretty incredible. They've collected all the text messages from the brothers at the fraternities. They've interviewed everybody. They've went back and collected text messages around the times of other hazings also. But this particular message said, and I quote, "There might actually be a problem. He fell 15 feet of a flight of stairs, hair first, going to need help," end quote. But they did not seek medical help for more than 12 hours, and instead, as viewed on the surveillance video, they poured water on Piazza, slapped him in the face, put a backpack full of books, as I mentioned, on his back to keep him from rolling over, and one student punched him in the abdomen to try to revive him. The students thought Piazza was drunk, but what he was experiencing, obviously he was intoxicated, but he also had a fractured skull and a lacerated spleen. So while this young man was punching him in the stomach to revive him, blood was seeping into his abdominal cavity. Piazza did come to at one point and tried to leave the party, but was confused, and they could see this on the surveillance video. He couldn't leave. He turned from the front door and he fell down the steps to the basement again. At some point, the students did bring him back upstairs and propped him up on the sofa. And the next morning, Piazza could be seen on the video lumped into a fetal position. At that point, one student came down the stairs in the morning and stepped over him and went on to his morning business. So the gauntlet was the pinnacle of the hazing process, but students also testified to other methods of proving themselves, such as being blindfolded and paddled, or what is referred to as branding, so that they're paddled so hard that a mark is left. I think that's assault. An elephant walk, which I'm going to absolutely leave to your own imagination, and telling the pledges that they were going to drink urine, but to their relief, it was only Gatorade. So in terms of how does theory, politics, and activism shape the spaces of feminism, I'm thinking about this case. I think our training as feminists cautions us from painting also fraternal culture with a broad brush. So as much as I deplore this type of institutional culture, I also have to recognize that there are fraternities and sororities that, as bell hooks might argue, offers a home place. These are houses that some of our African American, South Asian, and Asian students reside. There's also an LGBTQ house, which is not part of the Greek system, but we do have the house on campus. There has been no noticeable behavioral problems coming from these houses, and instead, these houses offer private spaces within a public university that is predominantly white. I admire the Piazza family as they understandably could be in mourning the loss of their son in a private space, but they have bravely taken on the fraternity, the district fraternity, and Penn State. However, again, as a social justice scholar, I have to wonder if this family would be getting the attention that in the national media if they were not white. The Piazzas have stated that their son would have never allowed this to happen to someone else, as he was deeply caring young man, and I'm sure he was. But I can only surmise that all the parents of those now charged with involuntary manslaughter could never imagine their sons would act in such an uncaring manner. As a feminist scholar who studies militarized forms of masculinity, I know that individuals' personal ethics can be eclipsed in favor of male bonding and social hierarchies. So for this reason, I think a feminist geopolitical analysis that examines care across scale might be helpful in dismantling different forms of institutional violence, and I'll leave it at that. Okay, thank you.
I'm still reeling from listening to that account. So I have the pleasure of introducing my sister, homie, friend, Dr. LaToya Eaves. I put this together without asking you any of the stuff that you do. So LaToya Eaves is an assistant professor of women's and gender studies at Middle Tennessee State University. Her research addresses the legacy of slavery and white supremacy in Southern spaces. Her work has appeared in Emotion, Space, and Society, and she recently co-edited a special edition of the Southeastern Geographer on Black geographies. She is the founder and president of the newly formed Black Geography Specialty Group. Which was held its first meeting at AAG this spring. She's also the visionary behind the Black Geography syllabus, which continues to be circulated, and cited and amended widely. And just in addition to her commitment to expounding the ways in which race, gender, and queerness inflects and informs our understandings of our relationships to and our ways in which we produce space, right? LaToya is a strong steward of the field of geography. Like, you represent geography real hard. And yeah, I think the discipline is really fortunate to have her. So, LaToya Eaves.
I don't know how to talk after that. Thanks, Willie. Dr. Wright. As of last week, Dr. Wright. And Willie also did the cover of our special issue of Southeastern Geographer, so and the essay on that. So yeah, so check it out. I want to thank everyone for coming, for being here. I'm at home. North Carolina is my home, so I'm happy to be here. So thank you, Sarah and Banu and Betsy and Alpha and everybody else who likes to welcome me to this, back to North Carolina and to this campus. I'm happy to be part of this conversation. During the first conference, I was writing my dissertation in 2014, so I'm glad to be able to attend here. Because I wasn't going when I was writing my dissertation. So if I had a title for my few moments of reflection, I would call it Feminist Discomforts or Encounter and Shift. And this is a conversation with myself as much as anything, but I'm just gonna tell you what I've been thinking about and what I've been challenging myself on. So, discomfort. Let's talk about discomfort. Out of many areas of discomfort over my life, I want to reflect on something that happened in my first year of graduate school. Coming during a class I took called Race and Ethnicity, which was in my first semester of my first year. or my second semester, my first year, not taught by a geographer, I should say before I continue. And over the course of that seminar, it became quite apparent that the approach to race and ethnicity that within the course was about tokenism, anomalies, and essentialisms. And one such comment from an important person in that class, or important piece of the community of that class, I will not say what part that person played, but said, "Oh, LaToya, your teachers must have treated you special." Or another kind of comment about what kind of food I would bring on my assigned date for the seminar, quote, "something fried or otherwise racial," was the comment made to me. And all of this made it clear that academia was going to be a lot harder than I thought. Because I now have to justify everything I do and everything I am, and everything I say. And all of this, and nothing I do can be done without being categorized and interrogated against and put up against what people believe Black women are or do. So I say that as I'm thinking about how to make sure I draw attention to, or I resist the seduction of drawing attention to and talking about people and places without rolling in the deep. And instead being in my comfortable place where I can, you know, sit and write behind my computer and forget to be engaged outside of the sphere of research and academia and all those things. Because it is comfortable and, to use Catherine McKittrick's word, terribly seductive to operate in essentialism. And if you've heard me talk somewhere before, I talk about Catherine a lot because I have Catherine and Clyde, so I quote them a lot. But Catherine talks about in her book, Demonic Grounds, if you've not read it, I mentioned it on the interview that I was asked to give that's on the blog. I think Catherine's work has been overlooked in feminist geography for far too long. Catherine says that this about our thinking, that if we think that stasis and physicality and the idea that space just is, and that we just look at people as human containers to be superficially evaluated and judged, then we're just totally missing so much. All of this draws on partial histories that we then have to, that we, again, are too comfortable with ourselves and what we think we know, and that LaToya is gonna bring fried food to campus and we're gonna eat it in class. That's dangerous. So, so that's first. Encounter. So in the interview posted on the conference website, I mentioned that one of the most exciting things, or what the question was posed, like, what's the most exciting thing you've read lately or what you've been excited about? I started reading not that long ago, Vivian May's Pursuing Intersectionality, Unsettling Dominant Imaginaries. And one of Vivian's arguments, I've had a lot of, I should say this first, that intersectionality is often called upon, but never like fully utilized, in my opinion. It's often just kind of like an additive identity politics kind of portrayal that's like, oh, let's, you know, use this word because it's sexy. And it kind of resonated with what you were saying, Kia, like we use it, but we don't really use it or live it out and that kind of thing. So Vivian says that though frequently used in research and policy focused on identity, marginalization, and social inequality, intersectionality is usually still applied primarily to those identities marked, quote unquote, marked as different, marginalized, or subordinated. Applications tend to concentrate on outsider or marginalized groups without analyzing the relationship to and with unmarked categories, i.e. privileged or dominant groups. So I think about this while I'm working, trying to figure out the best ways to move forward in my research. I think Willie covered a lot of what I've, you know, things that I work on, but I've been trying to resist a number of kind of discourses about what research is supposed to be. Somebody asked me, well, for a couple of years, I've been in a full-time lecturer role and not in a tenure track role. And so somebody asked me last year, like, well, when are you going to start your research again? Whereas in my opinion, my research never stopped because it's my lived experience. And I think also on the interview, I talked about, my upbringing and what that meant in terms of my feminist analysis and what I think about. But I've been thinking about how we challenge some of the, or how I challenge, and therefore if you'd like to take that on, that's also fine too, how we do things like naming certain things, like even methods, like we use something called participatory methods. And then we call upon them, or participatory action research, and we say that it's a collaboration and that it's built on reflection, but it's still, even in the way that it's set up, that we have to maintain some power hierarchies within that process that make things uneven. We're still expected to report to the IRB and follow certain guidelines and create this formulaic academic language to prove that we're worthy of something and produce. And this, of course, continues to create differences in hierarchies, and something that, where did Aaron go? Oh, there you are. So Aaron said, use the word untethered yet still tethered when we were talking outside. I think that's important to point out. So, which of course creates hierarchies by default. So it's important for us to shift away from the encounters that we have, like to re-reference Vivian. She in her book again, she talks about that oftentimes we reinforce these common denominator gender first narratives of feminist thought and action. And some versions of feminism serve to signify some differences that then continue to put things into hierarchy, because we do have to place some, like have to work within these institutions. But I wonder if there are ways that we can pull away from that too. So that leads me to shifting. So I try my best to be self-aware and look at areas that I want to improve within myself and the world that I want to see. I was born under the sign of Scorpio, and in my natal chart also, my Jupiter is in Virgo. When I did my spiritual gifts inventory not that long ago, my tie comes with administration and wisdom. And if you ever heard of Strengths Quest, my top 5 strengths are self-assurance, deliberative, relator, belief, and developer. And all that means I like action. I like to get things done. I like to listen to needs and find ways to make things happen. It makes me very happy. So my first year of graduate school was often crippled in frustration with the order that I had to work in. So instead, I've shifted out of being frustrated with people that I cannot change and creating a world into myself. And again, the things that I like to see. So the things that I'm excited about is moving away from the liberal feminist kind of individualistic model, which a lot of my personal frustrations lie within, and moving into re-inhabiting those frustrations to work towards making space for other people. That's why Black geography is so important to me, because there are so many people who need the space. So there it is. And there are people, students who need space on campus. So that's, part of what I want to do. And there are structures I want to challenge against. So that's, that's the road I've been going on. So of course, this is just the way LaToya's approach to things. And I recognize that differences exist between and among groups because, and that's part of what we're doing. So I mentioned also in that interview that part of what I hope we can do is to not reinterpret what people tell us when we do research, but to really, or to speak for them, but to let their voices come through more strongly, and not just our kind of appropriation of information or intentionally imposing academic language onto people who have absolutely nothing to do with academia at all. And therefore, if my sort of guide mark is if my grandma, or my mom, and my mother's passed away, but if mom can't read it, then then I shouldn't necessarily be writing it. If she doesn't understand it, that's my hallmark. But so, in recognizing that there are differences again that exist between and among groups, there are often times where we get kind of isolated within our groups, but due to the complexity of our global order, we actually interact with each other every second of the day. And I think that we forget about that. So even something, like climate change, for example, people, it's like whatever we're doing here is impacting somebody in some other part of the world. Human relationships are no different. Our global order is no different. It's not limited to the environment, but is also incorporates all of humanity. So is the ability of feminist practice in theory, politics, research, teaching, and activism that can resist some of these problems and these partial histories that, oh, the screen went blank. Oh, that's not a problem. The partial histories that are often kind of called upon. So again, I think that one of the important ways of doing is to not get comfortable and understanding that everything I do is embedded in a relationship to something somewhere else. And then a conscious reflection on subjectivity and structure. That's why the phrase, tell me who you are, not what you do, is very important to me, which I've been able to grapple with over the last couple of years, which includes all the way down to the pedagogy and the way that I teach my class. I teach in global studies and geography. And so I oftentimes teach students who have never had a feminist anything, and are primary, mostly undergraduates is what I teach. And I ended up teaching gender and globalization, which is the first time it's been taught on my campus ever, in the spring. So I'm trying to change some stuff again. And so it proved to be fascinating to teach students who are, primarily global studies students about gender and globalization and how to have a gendered framework for approaching all the things that they were doing. Haley, and I asked her if I could use her name in her paper. Haley is one of my students from that class. And then for her final project, she grappled with questions of trendiness in feminism, inspired by her reflections on both the Women's March and Beyonce, and how we might kind of work with this idea that because feminism is in such popular language now, social media has made this a much bigger thing than it ever was. I mean, if this were around in the 60s and 70s, social media were around in the 60s and 70s, I might write a dystopian past novel about what might social media have been like in the 60s and 70s to mainstream language and ideas and that kind of thing. And so, I think that part of the way that I shift is to make sure that I'm also embedded with these students in these conversations and people in my sphere, and that I infuse the language that I'm getting from people outside of feminist geography, outside of geography, outside of Black feminism and all those things, to make sure that those things make their way into, or make sure I don't get comfortable, like constantly reflecting on those things. So I get excited about that I get to teach students, number one, and I get to infuse multiple ways of knowing into places where it has received little attention before, which includes being a guest editor on Southeastern Geographer with Brian Williams at the University of Georgia and Adam Bledsoe, who's a PhD grad out of UNC, and a commentary by Catherine and including Willie's work. And so that leads me to a set of questions that I've been posing to myself that I'll end with. So this is me speaking to myself. LaToya, have you set aside your methods and let the people's methods become the driving force of your work? LaToya, who have you talked to today? And did they have anything to do with academia? LaToya, have you made your work public? And I appreciate Derek Alderman's approach to trying to get public scholarship, geographers being more public about their work as part of his leadership model. LaToya, where is your area of discomfort today? Recognizing, of course, that you're working in a world that was never meant to accommodate you. And LaToya, is this about you or is this about everyone else? So, thank you.
Okay. I am very honored to introduce Dr. Kumi Silva. I have been hoping for a long time that Kumi's work will be introduced to an audience of geographers beyond just here at UNC. And I think this is absolutely fantastic. Kumi is an associate professor in our Department of Communication here at UNC. She studies the intersections of feminism, identity, immigration, post-colonial studies, and identity culture. She's the author of this brand new book. It's called Brown Threat, Identification in the Security State. It's a really wonderful examination of identification in the security state in the post 9/11 world. And Kumi has just been an amazing mentor, I think, to me and to a lot of people that I see in this room. So here she is, Kumi Silva.
Thank you, Chris, for that really lovely introduction. And, you know, I've got a kid who goes to private school, so thanks for the plug on the book. I want to thank the organizing committee and Sarah and Banu especially, who contacted me quite coincidentally, because I feel like I should give some kind of context for actually being here. I have, one was that I had not planned to be here right now. I was not supposed to be in the country. And in January, had in fact emailed Sarah when the whole kind of conversation started, saying, well, I'm really sorry, but I'm leaving the country on April 29th, and I will not be back till July 29th. And then, you know, there was the executive order put into place. I was going to Germany for 3 months. And in February, I started getting really nervous because I was going with my family. And I had only very recently got my citizenship. And my book had just come out. And so I spoke to many people who had the authority to kind of tell me whether traveling was a good thing or not. And many of them said, it's not a good thing because, you know, at the border, when you come back, well, they can't let you not come back into the country, but one of the things they do now is Google you. And the first thing, if you Google Kumarini Silva, the first thing that comes is brown threat. So you don't want to be entering the country with like brown threat attached to your name. You will be, you know, you'll be there for a long time. And because I was, and certainly if I was traveling by myself or if it was just with my partner, I felt would have been okay. But they said, you know, they can separate you. You have an 8-year-old, just, you know, it might be best not to. So I was really, really disappointed because it was this really wonderful thing that I had been looking forward to, that I had to back out of. So I emailed Sarah and said, oh, great, I'm going to be around for the geography conference. I'm looking forward to that, something to look forward to. And then 2 days later, I saw her at the YMCA coffee shop. I don't know if many of you may not know that. And then Sarah said, oh, hi, you're on the keynote panel. So that's how I ended up here. So talk about border crossings and places you end up in. My other disclaimer is that I am not in geography, but if, you know, Betsy DeVos became Secretary of Education by claiming her parents were teachers. My father is a professor of geography. I'm totally legit. But I'm super excited to be here and so happy to be here. And so excited to share some of my thoughts, which those of you who don't know me very well will, I feel like I should warn you that I start writing things, and there are things that, and I have very strong feelings about many things. And I write them down, and then I think, oh my God, I shouldn't say these things out loud. But it was too late by the time I finished the last line yesterday, and I had only answered the first question. So I didn't have time to go back and write something else. So bear with me as I share everything that I have thought about in relation to the question that Banu and Sarah sent and the committee sent saying, and I only started with the first question, what are you most excited about? Like, that's like asking like a baby, are you really excited about eating a donut? I was thinking about the word excitement, and I thought that I would really like to replace the word excitement with animation and what animates me at different times. Hi, Jack. It's one of the really great things about being here is you get to see friends you don't often get to see. But I think I was going to kind of talk about these things, but maybe I'll read a little bit and I'll try and put as much inflection as I possibly can as I get very close to the mic and make it sound really important. So times like this provide numerous examples for reflecting on issues of identity, especially bracketed by and through nationalism and nationalist discourses. As a part of a larger project on misguided patriotism, and I want to say that book used that word before Trevor Noah did 2 weeks ago when he talked about misguided patriotism. So I said it first. I actually tweeted it to him and said, if you really want a description of misguided patriotism, buy the book. I did. I do things like that. It's really scary. I scare myself. So as part of this larger project on misguided patriotism, I've kind of started reflecting on the kinds of feminism and feminist activism that's kind of animated by nationalism at this particular juncture. I am especially interested in how feminism and popular forms of feminist activism intersect with American notions of comfort and how that notion of comfort unwittingly, and at least I am going to say unwittingly, I certainly hope it is unwittingly, reproduce other forms of identity-based segregation. Specifically, what comforting purpose do popular feminist activism provide, and what identities are produced, reified, hidden, celebrated, etc., vis-a-vis this comforting performance? Especially following all of my panelists, I think, who are the we who are being comforted by popular forms of feminism and feminist activism that we have seen in response to the 2016 election cycle and subsequent results. Some of you were in class with me when this discussion happened. I spent a lot of time thinking about the Women's March in DC and about Pantsuit Nation and also the Day Without Women. For me, these forms of speaking back reified a feminism that women of color, queer and trans feminists, among others, who are outside a normative white feminist framework, have spent decades trying to intervene in. It is a form of modulated comfort feminism that makes us feel good about ourselves if we have the means to be in and occupy those spaces as activists. And I really want to make clear that I'm not trying to belittle or trivialize the sentiments of those movements. I think that parts of feminism's validity and nourishment in neoliberal times depends on having some sort of public persona that can respond to, her nationalist male counterparts. So I understand to some extent, but that doesn't mean that it's not worth critiquing, I think. The means to be in and occupy those spaces are not just about conventional nodes of otherness, but more deeply historical relations that carry baggage and trauma far beyond what can be healed through comfort feminism. For example, let's consider the pink pussy hat as the quintessential cultural artifact of comfort feminism. Attesting to its mobility as both comforting and feminist, Missoni, the high-end Italian fashion house, featured pussy hats on their runway in spring 2017 as a public statement of support for the Women's March and a symbol against the rabid nationalist politics of the current US administration. Beautiful models in pink pussy hats. Currently, Missoni sells these pussy hats for $195. My own reaction to the hats was deeply visceral, a sense of both angst and anger. It was to me a symbol of gatekeeping, very similar to the ways that race-based gatekeeping happens in the United States. Simultaneously subtle and public, seemingly benign, but deeply and violently systemic. I fixated on those damn knitted hats for days. Where I originate from, knitting is associated with complex class structures. In colonial and post-colonial spaces where pussies are for the most part not pink, The skill of knitting or crocheting has long been associated with classes that largely benefited from or desired to be like the white colonial masters who ruled these spaces with a violent tyranny that was presented as justified and benign rehabilitation. We can also extend that head criticism to the day without women, and then juxtapose those feminist-based activisms against the day without an immigrant protest that was held separately. It's like a hot mess of split personalities for me. Like which one? Can I take all the days off? Like, does that count? This separation itself speaks to the ways that feminism is animated and deployed in times of national crises as separate from issues of race and immigration and class and labor politics, even though the Day Without Women was ostensibly about women and labor and equal pay. But really, I mean, and I know I'm like, again, I'm preaching to the choir, right? Like we all know that that was really problematic because while one woman was able to take a day off, her care labor was handed off to another woman who then handed her care labor off to another woman, and it was so on and so forth, right? So it was a really very problematic thing. And then I also realized I couldn't go shopping that day. I made my partner go to Target and buy me a red t-shirt. He bought the wrong red t-shirt, and I had to wear that and go and teach in class in a really horrible red t-shirt. And this was like stupid, like crazy shit that like makes you really schizophrenic. Wasn't it like it was that day, right? Like you're supposed to wear a red t-shirt. Yeah, so it's like, and it kind of makes you really nuts, right? Because you're getting all these messages and you're not quite sure what you're supposed to be doing. So this short-sighted uncoupling of feminism from other intersecting issues of identity have far-reaching consequences. This anxiety and crisis-driven times that were animated by its impact on and by white middle-class females depoliticizes feminism and flattens its complexity. Feminism becomes part of the whole woman as nation discourse. That's the I think that's what I'm kind of getting at. This is where I'm kind of like still mulling. Where protecting or harming a normative white femininity becomes a central mode of political conversation, privileged over intersectional feminist conversations that include race, class, economics, geography, space, migration, immigration, security, surveillance, capitalism. I could go on and on and on. At the same time that I'm critiquing these popular movements, I also understand why they exist. In times of crisis, we want comfort and reassurance. We want solutions, and often quick ones, right? Like the impeachment can't come fast enough. That we can get behind. My God, this is being live streamed. I just realized that. Often quick ones that can get behind. Now I really can't leave the country. I'm never gonna come back in. So in times of crisis, we want comfort and reassurance. We want solutions, and often quick ones that we can get behind and that we hope will provide swift change. But I also want to advocate for complexity and discomfort, to stay and keep breathing in the spaces that causes anxiety. I have done that for the last 25 years of my life. I moved here in 1992. To understand that anxiety, to recognize its history, and from that anxious, bile-inducing space, to produce a more equitable and just society. Thank you.
Thank you to our wonderful panelists for giving us so much to think about. I made a couple notes, then I'm going to actually let everyone ask their questions, and panelists can also engage with one another. So with Kia, really the emphasis on feminism as both a belief and a practice, and what we do, how we act makes a difference. I think that's a great point. And also the point about how institutional structures really affect the way that we produce knowledge, even when we recognize there are very different ways of actually producing theory and thinking. With Lorraine, this really disturbing story of what happened at Penn State and how it actually enables us to think about care ethics and its connection with geopolitics. Feminist geopolitics is really interesting, and banality of violence and what you said about destabilizing that kind of banality, how it becomes certain kinds of violence becomes normalized and expected. That's a really, I think, great point that I thought was really interesting. And with LaToya, I love the emphasis on discomfort. I think a lot of people mentioned that, and LaToya's feminist discomforts, I think, really has a lot of potential and kind of resonated with the recent piece Sarah and I wrote. Well, we were arguing that we have to be uncomfortable because comfort is just too easy and it's not going to work. We know that it hasn't worked. And similar emphasis on encounters and shifting, I think those give us a lot of thoughts, and I love the questions that you ended with for yourself. So that's great. Maybe we can follow up on some of those and ask you some of those. Right. And with Kumi, misguided patriotism, definitely. And then again, going back to this idea of comfort feminism, we have called it, I think, white liberal feminism, but I think I like this idea of comfort feminism and as a much more general way of speaking of like how when we are occupying those comfortable places, maybe we should be asking ourselves, why are we so comfortable? And what we, there might be actually, we need to intentionally seek discomfort and kind of to see things differently. So those are just some of the points that I wanted to highlight. And I'm sure the audience and you for each other would have questions or other points of engagement. So the floor is open for everyone, and we are live streaming. We didn't think about that when we did this, sorry.
So if you're going to ask a question, speak directly into the mic so that our viewers can see this. And we have 2 runners, just put your hand up high. No, I'm just gonna hand off the mic. So just hold on to that until we get okay.
Hello, I'm Megan Wood, a PhD student in the Department of Communication. I had a question for Kumi. I was really interested in the comfort feminism idea and wondering what you sort of think is the relationship between comfort feminism and what we sort of understand to be like the post-feminist sort of politics that we hear a lot about, right, in feminist theory.
So that's a fantastic question, and I think there is a strong connection, right? So it's part of the way I see comfort feminism is also it is a kind of rethinking or redoing of feminism within post-feminism, right? And I do agree that the connection is there. I haven't quite teased out because I think that there's something there that I want to kind of talk about that is also about claiming, like trying to kind of upgrade feminism in a particular way and go back to kind of a tradition of, is this on? I'm loud enough. I probably don't even need this. But it's partly about trying to also make like some kind of subtly, I think, okay, here's the thing. The part I find most problematic about comfort feminism is that it seems to kind of seamlessly resolve into the generational tensions. And that's to me what things like Pantsuit Nation and the Women's March did, was suddenly like, oh my God, we are all coming together. The sisterhood is alive. Like the sisterhood, no, just don't do that hot mess again. So like, but it's just this idea that it's actually something that can bring all of us together. And it's kind of like this coming together, like the celebration of that with there's comfort in that, right? Suddenly that the issues are resolved and that we are all like coming together around this. That is very much to do with kind of post-feminist thinking, I think.
So something I wrote, I'm sorry to jump, something I wrote and then deleted because I didn't want to be too harsh was, I was like, I should have done what Kumi did and just say what I wanted to say. But so I think that one of the So it's like, oh, we're like comfortable and coming together and everything's great. And it's part of that whole long trajectory of like, oh, if we just have this, then everything will be solved. And if we just have the right to vote, then everything will be solved. And then if we just have this, everything will be solved. But that's really so like monolithic, and was one of the problems with, I think, the Women's March and Pantsuit Nation more broadly, because it didn't engage and go beyond this this one idea of what womanhood, pink, all these things are supposed, and then still ascribing to pinkness too. I mean, it just continued to problematize everything, and I think that's under acknowledged. Yeah, and then it was also, you know, like in the wake of the election, I'm just part of me has been really surprised that people didn't see it coming, because I saw it coming. The night I was actually working here at UNC the night Obama got elected in 2008, and my first thought was cool, and then my second thought was, oh God, because I could sense a shift in the underbelly of the world that had to come back out to be dealt with, because it wasn't dealt with before. So. Don't be scared.
Hi, thank you all for your comments. This has been a really thought-provoking panel. My sort of question, I guess, is mostly directed toward Lorraine. I was really taken with and thought it was really productive to think about the culture of violence and its relationship to masculinity through the lens of the Piazza case and kind of fraternity culture on campus. And I guess I want to kind of think about the culture of violence that kind of accompanies masculinity in relation to different, what some people would call different masculinities. I'm interested in how you might respond to you know, the idea of trans masculinity, which in some ways like traffics in or kind of reinscribes forms of masculinity. And I think that those reinscribed forms of masculinity are implicated in the violences that you talk about as being kind of collective and cultured in the frat arena. But I don't know, I just was kind of wanted to hear you maybe tease out what the implication of masculinity and its culture of violence might be with respect to trans masculinity.
That's an amazing question that I have to say I haven't given that much thought to, and I'm glad you asked me about it. I think for me, I'm very concerned about different forms of masculinity getting eclipsed by kind of monolithic type of masculinity that I see at play, right? So in terms of trans masculinities, I'm not sure. I mean, I'd like to ask you what you're thinking about that. I'm turning this back on. Does she still have a microphone? Yeah. So.
Well, I guess I don't have a fully thought out analysis, but I guess if, you know, an idea or an identity like trans masculinity, you know, calls upon a familiar concept like masculinity, then it is borrowing from and representing itself along the lines of that identification. And so necessarily the associations, I guess, both positive and negative, come along with that identification. So I was wanting to maybe think out or tease out and maybe kick it back to other people on the panel or in the audience.
I mean, this is a really great question, and it's really making me think. And I think we have to be very careful on how we think about masculinity, and that it doesn't necessarily. I mean, that's where I'm hoping the intervention can be. That masculinity doesn't have to be violent. It doesn't have to be hegemonic. That it's not predetermined. I think it's socially determined. And so the sense of you're right. Like, in terms of trans masculinity, if it's adopting a certain monolithic notion of masculinity, then I would say it's problematic. But if it's not, and it's destabilizing this monolithic masculinity that I'm seeing in let's say a frat house, or I'm seeing in with the groups that I've worked with in the military, then I think it can be quite problematic. So to me, masculinity doesn't have to be, I mean, for me, I think the feminist intervention that I would try to make at Penn State is saying, this is not boys being boys, this is boys being assholes. Oh shit, we're again, this is simultaneous. And so, that's not what masculinity should be, and potentially can be. And so, so what that, destabilizing that model for me would be really, really important, without having, and again, I'm very grounded with that. That's why I actually use this case. Like I need the actual instance, and then I theorize from that. And so for now, I would have to leave it at, what would that masculine model look like? And so if it's something that is in all hegemonic, it is all at all violent, then I would say that's where the feminist intervention needs to be, in any type of masculinity. I'm not quite, I'm sorry, I don't think I'm fully answering your question, but I really need to think about it. So maybe we can talk again over the course of the conference, because I need to think about that.
Yeah. I sort of have a question also about, you talked about the banality of violence at Penn State, and I think we could say that across the board at most universities, just in different forms. I mean, there's the case at Baylor now also, right? Or rape, which you mentioned on college campuses. And I was just wondering, what do you see as being the function of this banality, of this kind of normalization? I'm thinking about boundaries and kind of how it implies who belongs and who doesn't belong sort of on campuses, especially with respect to women, in that, you're not really a member of this community because you can't be safe. Although a lot of female students don't always know that. If you give them the statistics that 1 in 4 female students is raped in college, they're like, what? Or these women who go to the frat houses looking for a boyfriend or future husband, but maybe something else happens. But I was just wondering if you've thought about what role or what function this normalization of banality plays.
I think the role of banality is actually in terms of everyday violences, is what builds and allows for the extraordinary forms of violence. So so for example, some of the terms that I picked out of the document, such as backpacking and gauntlet, that in that culture, that's just everyday discourse. As well as the text messages that were incredibly violent, but for these young men were play. So to me, it's that making violence banal is what leads to this extraordinary moment where somebody dies. But I also, part of that too, when I think about a lot of my female students tell me that when they go to fraternity parties, they go in teams, and they make sure no one is alone or one person is not drinking, and that this is crazy, right? This is absolutely mad. But yet for them it's very banal. It's just life as usual. This is what you have to do. And so and at some point, again, they're going to get hit with that statistic and then think that that's extraordinary, right? And it is extraordinary, but this banality, and I agree also that it tends to, I think the reason that it tends to have, there's all sorts of violence that we don't hear about, too, extraordinary violences that I don't think that they're banal, but I think that they're invisible. So I'm trying to play around, and I don't have this completely thought out yet. I think there's a difference between invisible forms of violence and also banal forms of violence, and so where invisible is more with, as you point out, groups of people that people don't notice the violence towards them, versus enacting everyday forms of violence and not thinking much about it.
to that, I was wondering, this is so strange. But I was also thinking that it's one of the things I think we don't acknowledge in the United States is that this is by history, the very foundation of this country is violent. The Constitution is violent. It's made to protect a small group of people at the expense of a larger group of people, right? So I think the banality, that's the complex aspect of banality within the United States around violence, is that it's everywhere. Everything is around the structure of violence. So it's really hard to think about, but we're directed to look at particular forms and identify really readily other forms of violence, right? So we understand that heterosexual sexual violence is violence, and it's been, and then we recognize the way that that's more like animated through banal activities like going in groups and like expecting to be assaulted. But we also miss the other forms surrounding that and reinforce that and normalize that outside of it, right? That I think is really kind of significant and I think really challenging for us to see, because it kind of it challenges the possibility, right, of overcoming this. Like it seems really huge, and I think it kind of goes back to about that notion of comfort too, right? Like of wanting to say, okay, if we can identify this little thing, we can fix this thing, and then everything will be okay. But I think I think what's really interesting is from your work is that it's kind of showing that it's a much larger system that is coming up in this one little, well, not little, but very big incident.
And I think, I'm not going to be good at that. And I think part of when you're referring to comfort too, is that these laws and policies that get put in place, somehow everybody gets this level of comfort that, oh, it's under control now, where it's not at all. So that's yet another layer, that layer of comfort in leadership, whether it's leadership of a country, leadership of an institution, as if they're enacting some kind of policy change, then things are certainly going to get better without looking at the much broader context of this cultural violence that you're pointing to, which is really important.
Hi, this question is for LaToya. So I am also a huge McKittrick fan, and I wanted to ask you, how do you problematize your teaching of intersectionality with the work of McKittrick, who in my reading is looking at intersectionality as promoting the space of marginality, kind of like reifying this idea of a space of victimhood instead of a space of potentiality. So I see a contradiction in intersectionality because of that, and so I wonder what your take is on McKittrick's work and how you use her to teach intersectionality.
That's a big question. Well, I think that I still like put intersectionality in a Black feminist context first. So I mean, they fit together automatically, and I see what you're saying, and I think that's one of the interesting things about when you when a term becomes, is entered into discourse, and then it just kind of like evolves into all these other things. And so a lot of times I try to because Kimberly Crenshaw is, doing African American Policy Forum. And so I try to keep in touch with, keep them, and subscribe to their listserv to see what Kimberly is working on now. And how she's, continuing to engage in that conversation, that in that, that set of 89 and 91 works that she used that terminology, but of course has a longer trajectory that goes with it. But I think that Catherine and Kimberly both they talk to each other more than, more so than anything. I think that their frameworks are just different because Kimberly is in a political sphere, and in the role of politics and justice, and Catherine is grappling with land and creativity and so putting them into I think that's why I'm like currently in love with Vivian again. Who's at Syracuse, if you don't know Vivian May, she's at Syracuse, and she just finished a term as National Women's Studies Association president. And she, because she is like, wait, we really do need to acknowledge like these origin stories first. So anything that I teach in feminism or almost any class that I teach goes all the way back, maybe about 500 years. Like I always acknowledge like these longer trajectories that come within, even when they don't necessarily feel relevant. I challenge my students on making the connections between what happened in Peru in 1622 and what is happening at UNC in 2017. I mean they're inseparable to me. So I try to make that connection. Am I answering what you're asking?
Yeah, I think I'm mostly trying to, I feel like we're not looking at the margins as a site of potentiality, and I guess
I'm glad you said that.
That's what I'm kind of trying to get at, because I'm like TAing for these introductory gender classes, and intersectionality is the lens, right? And I have this conflict of teaching intersectionality of this, like, we try to problematize it, but I think there's something inherent about this pedagogy, teaching to young people who have never thought about feminism, that necessarily ends up additive. And I'm kind of doing, Sylvia Winter McKittrick work that's like basically saying, these are tools that Europe created for us. Why are we operating that way? And so I'm just trying to deal with identity politics and teaching to young people where I want to teach them radical praxis first thing. But that's where Bell Hooks is our book, right? So I just am having this conflict of like wanting to live out my ethics of like doing radical praxis to a population that has never been exposed to feminism,
Sure. I'm glad you reset the margin thing, because a few years ago, Chandra Mohanty said, what if, like, why are we re-centralizing? Like, why push people to the center? Why don't we expand the margins instead? So I think that hits, exactly where Kimberly and Catherine and Sylvia all talk, kind of talk into. And I think it's interesting to, in addition to, like students who've not been introduced to feminism at all in an age where we want quick fixes. I don't remember who said that. And where the attention spans are kind of limited, and, like how you like kind of deal with all the other distractions to really like get it to go home. And, it's something that we can continue to think about. I always ask people about the women in their lives. I mean, I think that's, and like kind of mapping out where they come from and what it all means as an entry point to anything. Because that's the way that geography made sense to me, and a lot of other things, being in college and all of that was like, how does this impact me? And if it doesn't make sense on that level, then, it's not going to resonate. I took my class. There's a traveling exhibit. Now I'm going to forget the name of it, but it was we had it at MTSU, where some academics were kind of archiving what it meant for their bodies to work in academia, and so like some of the artifacts of what they were doing. I know somebody was at Florida State, somebody was at MTSU, and I can't remember where this other person was. So I took my students to this exhibit. It's like, what does it mean to be a body doing something in the world and producing? And having those reflections. And then I'd ask them to go home, you know, and say, what does it mean for, you know, what does a body mean to you? And how is your body structured? And what impacts does that have on you? And I said, and then create something from it. And it was interesting that, you know, like the kinds of things that came out of it with people like drawing pictures or people like bringing objects and that kind of thing. I feel like is, you know, helpful. Are we wrapping up on time? I'm gonna give it to Kia.
I just had a thought, and I know Arturo had his hand up also, but thinking about how we teach feminism and how it can be taught starting with women of color, for example, or non-US women, instead of starting with the feminine mystique. I don't know if people still do that. Or Gloria Steinem, or, you know, our bodies, ourselves. You know, but starting with the Combahee River Collective Statement maybe, and that's 40 years old this year, and that's what the National Women's Studies Association Conference, it's focused on that. But, and then Kimberly Crenshaw, she has a great TED Talk. I don't know if you've seen it, called The Urgency of Intersectionality. And you can get to it through the African American Policy Forum website. But I mean, she's trying to make intersectionality really concrete in terms of, say, her name and the invisibility of police violence against Black women. And she talks about how there's really no frame for understanding that, because we think about violence against Black men, right? And that's what the popular consciousness focuses on. But I do think that if we decenter white liberal feminism and give students a different starting point, that it becomes, I think, more inclusive also, where you're bringing sexuality into the discussion in class and race, so that they don't have to then add on. They're already kind of starting with a more expansive definition of feminism. So.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
What's it? Hold it for just a minute. Everyone brings me down.